From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and concerned citizens making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melathopoulos, Assistant Professor in Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. There are some guests that I have been actively stalking for some time. Kim Patten is at the top of that list. Kim just retired as the Washington State University Extension Pacific County Director and has spent 30 years helping cranberry farmers and oyster harvesters, two things that you might not see together in any job description anywhere. But he spent a lifetime working with pollinators, and if you were at the Pacific Northwest Pollinator Conference and Summit, you would have seen him get the prestigious Bill Stevens Lifetime Achievement Award for all the work that he's done. Kim is a permanent fixture in most of my extension talks. You'll probably see a smiling face standing next to a cranberry bog with some blooming heathers at some point when you hear me speak. But despite my best efforts, including doing some recordings with him by Cranberry Bog, I just have not been able to pin him down. This is my opportunity. This is a great episode for farmers who are looking for cost-effective ways to create pollinator habitat. Kim did this years ago, and a lot of this work wasn't really recognized because it was at a time when there wasn't a lot of attention on bees. Anyways, I'm glad to bring this to you finally. Here's Kim Patten talking to you about building pollinator habitat around working farms. Okay, Kim. So you've just retired from one of the most unique extension positions, I think, in the Pacific Northwest. Tell us what your position was focused on and where you're located.
Well, I'm at WSU Long Beach, which is sort of in the southwest corner of the state, right where the Columbia River exits, or sort of other side of the river of Astoria. It's a one-man research station that's been there since the 30s that was established to put in to work on cranberries, and it sort of survived the millennia of cuts over the last 100 years or so. And it sort of, I was there for 30 years. It sort of, the position evolved from working with cranberries to working on invasive species, to working on shellfish. And so when I retired, it was basically a pest management specialist in dealing with cranberries, invasive species, and shellfish. And it was a blast because you got to work on some pretty off the wall things, and whatever you did was, pretty essential for those industries. And if you weren't doing it, there was some major suffrage by the industry.
Well, I do remember you were awarded the Bill Stevens Lifetime Achievement Award, Bill being one of the premier bee biologists in the Pacific Northwest. And I remember getting letters from the community, and they were so supportive. It was like you were like the jack of all trades. You solved all the problems in that county.
Well, that was the fun part of it. Is like, okay, it's just about solving problems. So what's the biggest problem, and how do you solve it? And it's sort of putting together these puzzles and putting together the teams and the people and working with all sorts of great people to solve problems. And that's why it was so much fun.
Well, the reason I've invited you onto the show is cranberries. Now, I think most people, when they think about cranberries, they think about Wisconsin or they think of someplace out east. But the Pacific Northwest does have this cranberry region. Tell us a little bit about the industry, where it's located, and what the cranberries are like.
Cranberries were brought into the Pacific Northwest around the 1880s, both in down in the Bandon area and then in sort of the southwest corner of Washington. They were brought in bales of vines from Massachusetts because these areas were very similar to sort of the coastal dunes on the East Coast where cranberries grew wild, and it was sort of a burgeoning crop back then, and it was sort of developed over the last 100 plus years. And it's very unique in terms that it likes sort of this acid, cool environment, and it really never moved out of those areas, and it never really expanded, and it grows reasonably well in those areas. It's very shallow rooted, so it doesn't do well unless you can keep it well watered, and it's a very unique crop, and the conditions for growing it are unique as well as how you grow it. So it's sort of kept within a very restricted area in these parts of the state, but at the same time, it's been critical for the economy of those areas for this entire time period.
Because there really isn't a lot of crops grown west of the Cascades, of the Coast Range.
No, not unless you're talking about shellfish and timber. There's very little, and so this is one of those successful things. It's grown on a commercial large scale, and so I think Oregon is fourth in the nation, and Washington fifth in the nation in terms of production. So it's it's significant. It's still dwarfed by what they grow in Wisconsin, but still it's very significant.
What is there anything unique about growing cranberries here as opposed to there? I mean, you talked about the similarities and one of the reasons it was brought over, but what is kind of like strange about growing them here?
Well, they prefer acid soils. They were traditionally grown sort of in a peat environment, and that's where was much more prone to in these areas. Now we kind of grow them in sand with irrigation. So initially they were established where they could be grown. This was before we had irrigation, so you need sort of these conditions that stayed wet for a long period of time. But they're very shallow rooted. They don't do well under really hot conditions, so it doesn't. And they like these acid environments, so it doesn't leave much of the state as far as growing. And then once they were established, that's where the industry grew up, and because it's sort of this familiarity and uniqueness. That's where they're grown now, and there are a few people that break out and try to grow them in new areas, and they tend to do okay. But the whole support industry for cranberry growers is right where in these little small areas, and kind of grow where there's a support industry.
Now,
Let's be like ocean spray and so forth.
Oh, right. Okay. All right. So we've got it in these little pockets. So Bandon, the Long Beach area, I guess in British Columbia, sort of in around.
There's in that area has been there's like 7,000 acres, and that's really expanding up in the Fraser River Valley there. But that's a different story.
Okay, so but cranberries are in the Ericaceae family, and they do require pollination. And I know that the honeybees are brought in for doing pollination. Maybe just to begin with, just tell us a little bit about the pollination of cranberries, and then we'll get into some of the other pollinators.
I guess cranberries could be classified as they need cross pollination. They would be, I would call them pollination challenged. They're porocidal anthers, and so that pollen doesn't come out very easily, and so you kind of almost have to sonicate or vibrate that pollen to shake it loose, and that's why bumblebees.
The pollen's on the interior surface of the anther, not like on a dandelion that's out on the
surface. Right. Okay. And so it kind of has to be vibrated out, and so bumblebees, when they go out there and they buzz a frequency, it shakes the pollen comes off, and they're very good at pollinating these things. And other insects struggle to get that pollen, and they don't have a lot of nectar. So there's very little selfing. So if you don't have good pollination, you don't have a crop. And since they bloom usually in June, and we tend to be wet and rainy and miserable, and bees don't really fly that well. And so there's always issues with getting good pollination. And in the earlier times, when prior to large commercial beekeeping ventures that were brought in bees, everyone relied on bumblebees, and you were kind of dependent on a natural population. and the areas were smaller, and there was a lot of wild native environment around there, and the bumblebee populations were generally healthy, and so you probably could get by without honeybees. And now we have these denser cropping situations, and if you don't bring in bees and you have a lot of colonies or a lot of acres together and high producing vines, your production doesn't do as well. But there are lots of issues with the honeybees, and they just don't do as well. And so there's always been an interest in, can we get bumblebees to work better? And if you go back, pollination scientists sort of are famous for reinventing pollination research from the last 100 years or so. And so if you go back in the literature, back in the 20s and the 30s and 40s and 50s, there was a lot of work on cranberry pollination and so forth. And everyone knew, bumblebees are great for pollinating. And so there was work done on, okay, how can you manage these, and building bee boxes and putting them out there and looking at some of the species that were key. And this was, throughout all the cranberry growing areas. But
and you,
sort of,
yeah, go ahead, Kim.
No, go ahead.
So you were part. I was thinking it's like the reinvention of research, because you were doing. So you kind of picked up on this work, and you were doing bumblebee research before. This was back in the 90s when people weren't thinking about bees in the same way. Tell us how you got started with looking at, taking a second look at bumblebees.
This is the early 90s, and we started. Well, we were initially concerned. There was concerns about pesticides on. There wasn't any data on what were the effects of pesticides, or very little data on effects of pesticides on bumblebees. And of course, we kind of knew that bumblebees were important, but how could you manipulate them? Looking at sort of the pollination ecology, looking at sort of the pesticide toxicology, and then at that time also they were just starting to look at commercialization of bumblebees, and that was sort of new and starting to kind of come on stream, and so kind of got involved a little bit at a time, and then it kind of, this is such a fun, sexy project. You just got to keep going at it, because there wasn't that much stuff being done, and it was really exciting. It was also pretty new for me and some of the stuff we were doing, but it was also, you're kind of reinventing some of the wheel, anyways. But there was a lot of interest, because it seemed like a way that you can easily manipulate or get a better production.
It seems like one of the things that you discovered was, and I think is really kind of pivotal to your work that I find fascinating. I use it as an example whenever I talk to people about vegetation management, is just the matching of the bee species with the crop, and then matching up all of those things. And I think one thing I'd like you to expand a little bit about, you found that not all bumblebees are equal because of when they start and finish their nests. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there, if you look at the species that were out in the wilds, then there were sort of three main ones. There was Mixtus, Pigus, and Occidentalis, and you started looking at trying to match, their biology with the biology of the cranberry, and when and you would find all species working cranberries. But some of them would, like the Pigus, would come in really early and they peak and crash, and so you get, a good week or so, and cranberries bloom over like a 6-week period from early June to mid-June to early July there, and so that force would go down, and then Mixtus would come in, but they would not last as long either. But so the one strong ones that we were seeing pretty dominant out there was the Occidentalis.
So just to pick up on that, quick on that point. So when you mean crash, the something like that black-tailed bumblebee, the Bombus melanopygus, they'd finish
Yeah.
their colony cycle because cranberries are so late
Right.
before.
So they have a short cycle. So, the queen comes out really early in January and February. It has really actually a small number total population. So it goes through its entire cycle and is over with by the time cranberries start to bloom. So you're just picking up on a few resident residual workers and the new queens that are actually doing the work, and the actual population, depopulation, was probably a month before you were even in bloom, and almost the same with mixes. I mean, they're out there, but their peak forces were long beforehand, and you're just seeing the residual end of the colonies.
Okay, sorry to
die out.
sidetrack you there. But anyways, you were telling us about occidentalis, the numbers for the western bumblebee were really, really high.
Yeah, and so if you look at those, we looked at a lot of the colonies, and you decide, you're kind of following how many workers, how many males, drones, how many queens over the entire time period. But if you look at the occidentalis colonies, they were just sort of in peak population during cranberry, and they lasted an entire time period, and they were in pretty significant numbers in all the farms out there, and that was pretty good. So then you start looking at, well, how do we go about manipulating these populations so that we can make them more dependable, more reliable, and less contingent on environmental factors, and how can we actually build up our populations around our cranberry farms? And so that was kind of the phase two. Let's match, let's see what's out there. Let's try to figure out what we need, and now let's see if we can actually manipulate it. And we looked at, can we use bumblebee boxes? And we put out hundreds and hundreds of these, and we got them to nest mostly by melanopygus. But I remained unconvinced that it really changed the population. It was kind of a feel-good thing. Okay, we put out bee boxes. There were some bees in there. Oh, I felt good. I saved the world. But it probably didn't do anything to change the population on the farm. And
okay, that's good to know, because everybody always asks about bumblebee boxes, and there's not a lot of people who've had that level of experience. Okay, so you tried bumblebee boxes, and then what did you move on to?
Well, then we looked at, sort of the whole ecology, the landscape ecology, and saying, okay, where do you find large numbers of these, and in terms of, and what's the, you call it, landscape around that environment. And so, these smaller beds, small farms that were 3, 4, 5 acres surrounded by forest, you'd always find, large populations of bees. And so you can figure out, well, okay, it's probably, there's nesting site limiting. It could also be forage food limiting. And so we started looking at, well, what if it was forage food limiting? How could you manipulate that? And you looked at for what's blooming and when, and what's sort of the weak links in the food resources. And these queens come out early, you'll start seeing melanopygus queens in January, February, and then mixes in sort of February, March, and April, and occidentalis a little bit later. But and so there's not much blooming other than willow and a few other things that are kind of dicey as far as it's. I mean, there's enough resources, but they're not necessarily where you want them to be. So we looked at, well, what can we grow that is easy to grow around farms, that is pretty durable, that's easy to low maintenance, and so forth. We started looking at planning, evaluating a lot of species and what species had to support a good population, particularly of the queens. And we were particularly interested in newly emerging queens, and then in the spring, because they sort of really need to build up their reserves. And then we were also interested in sort of the late summer resources because there's nothing blooming in sort of late summer when all the new queens have been mated and they're looking to build up their fat reserves for hibernation, and looking at those two windows and what we can bloom, and put out a lot of gardens and try to evaluate sort of resources by some of these criteria. Can you grow it easily? Is it sort of easy to establish? Is it not too invasive? Is it a long bloom time and so forth? And I narrowed it down to a lot of the winter blooming heaths and heathers and some of the late summer blooming heaths and heathers because they're pretty and they're easy to grow and they're low maintenance and they tend to do a pretty good job. And I don't have any data per se that's saying, well, if I plant, a quarter acre of these, I can increase my population of bumblebees by X amount. But you can certainly, I think it does bring those queens in to around your farm and helps them grow. And I think that intuitively, I've done the research in my head that it is working, but it's really hard to document population, dynamics and do these controlled experiments where you're looking at how do you manipulate, successfully feral populations. But it looks pretty good overall, and it's been successful. And growers really like it. And we put a lot of these sites out there.
Well, let's take a quick break. I want to come back and just talk more about these heather plantings. But let's take a quick break, and then because I'd like to get into how these are established. I think there's a lot of growers that would like to be interested in these kinds of models. I get this question all the time. Let's take a quick break.
Okay.
We are back. So I'm really intrigued by this finding of these plants. You said you started out with bee boxes, but then you quickly transitioned onto this idea of like putting in pollinator habitat adjacent to cranberry bogs. Tell us, you did a lot of work, I know, trying to figure out before settling on heathers. Tell us a little bit about the process of a little bit more about the process of selecting plants.
Well, I had a postdoc from New Zealand, Rob McFarlane, he was a really good, I think, an overall naturalist. And so he just drove up and down the coast from Northern California up into British Columbia at different times and sort of surveyed what the bumblebees were working on and how attractive they were and how many what species were working what and what sort of the attractiveness, and then we kind of from there developed some sort of rating scale, and this is both native and non-native, a rating scale of plants, and we probably had 50 to 100 plus plants in there that were.
For the listeners, it was a remarkable study. Like, I think nobody's really, because it happened in the 90s before people were paying attention, but I have never seen anything quite like that study of kind of like this broad geographic sweep looking for plants. I find it remarkable, and it's a shame that people don't know about this work.
Well, and I wish we kind of, in hindsight, should have put a little more academic rigor to it and published it like a lot of that stuff, but you end up chasing other things over time. But anyhow, we end up settling on the heathers because they sort of had this nice window of the winter and the late summer in terms of when they could provide resources, and they really didn't compete with the bloom when cranberries are blooming. So that because you don't want to draw stuff away from the bogs. And also during this, let's say May to July, there's tons of stuff blooming already. You don't need anything else. There's everything in this grandmother's out there blooming. It's not I don't think resource plants are the limiting factor out there. But what was limiting again was these winter and late summer things, and so that's what we focused on.
Well, I can imagine a dispersing bumblebee flying through a very windy a very windy coastal landscape and seeing this spring heather blooming. If I were her, I would make a nest close by. That would be
Oh,
my instinct.
absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you can anthropomorphize and put on your bumblebee wings and fly over there and say, "Hey, this is heaven." And we did that lots.
But then I imagine then they would that spring blooming heather would come out of bloom. The cranberries would come. They've already established nests. They'd move to the cranberry, but then having that summer heather, they still need to complete their reproduction, and so having just enough juice to finish off the nest must increase the population over time. You would think.
Yeah, well, you would think so. And these plants bloom over a long time. I mean, they're 2 to 3 months worth of bloom on there, so it's not just a boom and I'm over. So it's a sustained resource, and I think that's the valuable part of the heathers that are pretty unique to them.
And heathers are grown in nurseries. They're not an expensive plant, I imagine, when it comes to shrubs.
Yeah, and it's sort of the only thing they don't have going for them is they're not native, really.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are some native ones, but they're not really the ones that we grow are not native, and people are more attracted and really want to plant natives for the bumblebees. But I think if you're looking at from a production or from a value point of view, these work very well. And again, they're low maintenance, they're long blooming, they're easy to establish, they're not too invasive. Now, I underline the two. We did in one site we put them right adjacent to the cranberry bog, and they have now grown into the cranberry bog, and so they've become a pest in that regard. But so you do have to keep a little bit of a separation, but it's really, I think it's a good system, and they're just so durable.
Well, give it now that you have the hindsight of all this experience. Tell us if you were a grower and you wanted to establish heathers to attract in bumblebees, what would be the ideal kind of placement, site prep? Do you need irrigation? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, they are fairly drought tolerant, but of course everything grows better if you've got some irrigation. I think one of the concerns, if they're too close to your farm, or to your actual cranberry bog, we cranberry growers tend to put everything out through their sprinklers. So that would be they fumigate through their sprinklers. And so if you're putting out insecticide and which you would do after the honeybees are removed, and you're putting it through your sprinklers, and if your heathers are blooming and there are bumblebees on that could pose a risk. And so you want them far enough away from the farm so they would not have some incidental exposure to pesticides.
So like a 20 or 30 foot buffer from the
bog.
Something
like that. Wouldn't be much, but you want them close enough so that they could bring in the bumblebees. Bumblebees, they'll travel some distance. We did a lot of distance work in there, and so 100 meters are fine. But you get beyond that, I think they really start to, their densities reduce in terms of their foraging. But so they're find a good site that it's got some any sort of site that's not relatively easy to grow them, weed free or whatever, and you can buy them from the nursery and grow them your own. They're easy to self root once you have them, and start them with irrigation. There's some of the winter ones. There are literally thousands of species of these. Not street species, but thousands of selections and strains out there that is kind of confusing. But heathers, yeah. And so the winter heath, like the Erica by Daliensis or the Erica carnaria, are anything in there that's not sort of a showy flower. It's pretty because you kind of want to mix and match colors and make something that's attractive. And there's some great books on how to grow heathers and how to what varieties do well. And so you would get some for the winter, maybe a mix of selections there. And the more space you dedicate to this, probably the better. And then for the summer, you want something that's going to sort of do this July, August, September bloom, and that's sort of the Caliana vulgaris and the Erica carnaria, and there's lots of strains and selections in there also, and just sort of mix and match and in there, and you can put them all these together in some sort of pattern or however you want. But and once they establish, they're pretty much maintenance free. So that first year irrigation is nice, but once they're going, they're tough. And
seem to be the ones at the WSU extension facility in Long Beach. I remember maybe there was a little bit of horsetail, but really it was clean. Those were old beds, and there wasn't a lot of weeds in them.
Initially we had to weed them a little bit first year too, but they even outgrew the horsetail. I mean, it gets pretty thick in there, and they can be pretty aggressive within themselves. I mean, so you do want to give them. You don't want to put them too close to the bog, like as you notice, that's where they grew into, or one of our research bogs. But they take care of the weeds themselves quite well if you give them a chance.
Did you lay in the ones that you've done weed fabric necessary to kind of help them out, or is that kind of overkill?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
It's a matter of,
because we're not talking about an acre of heather. We're talking about like a 12 feet by.
You could put in some weed mats or something like that for you're probably getting these from 1 gallon containers from the nursery. You can lay them out there in weed mats, and it would make it it'd be really make it pretty easy to do that. Throw in some irrigation for the first year, or even some of this shorter term mulch, or you can mulch for your weeds. I mean, there's lots of options, and they're relatively an easy to grow landscape plant, compared to a lot of other things. And they also, they don't have a lot of height, so they're not going to obscure the views. You're not going to have to prune them or train them or do anything with them in the future.
And I have to say, it looks nice from the farm. I remember being in Milton Freewater this summer, and there was a beautiful lavender hedge right by the road, by the vineyard, and it just made the farm look nice.
Yeah, and lavender's another one of those that look nice too. It does, lavender can overgrow into some of the other arboreal things, but a lot of these other plants that I think have a dual purpose of, especially around farms that you might get customers in there in terms of they're pretty.
Absolutely.
And but again, I will say that, can I document that I have increased my population of bumblebees on the farms where we put this at? Probably not, just because there's too many other variables out there controlling populations. But you do see a lot of queens working those things, and so you're assuming they're nesting somewhere close to that area.
It must be hard, though, to measure that. I mean, I've seen studies where they look at agricultural landscapes, and they may look at bee recruitment, but they're talking about small bees. Bumblebees have a long flight range, and the other thing I think people may not appreciate about either the Bandon area or Long Beach is there's a lot of natural habitat. It's really not like other farming. You have a bog in and amongst the forest.
yeah, and so there is not a lot of other places. I mean, it is hard to track these things, and where do they go and where they work. Now, actually, Bandon is really unique because in some of these farms, it's just surrounded by hundreds, and in some cases thousands of acres of gorse, and gorse is very competitive.
Have you ever seen a bee on gorse?
I have never seen a bee on gorse. I mean, it would be great if they were gorse, but and it's just not. Maybe there's probably some other other pollinators working gorse, but I've never seen anything.
The last thing I just want to maybe just to tie things off, it is not an easy place for bees to be. I mean, I don't think we have tremendous bee biodiversity west of the coast. It is a windy, place. And I imagine for honeybees, it can be hard. There must be days when the bees just cannot get out.
Oh, it's we spend a lot of time looking at, okay, can we manipulate honeybees, and can uh, we can feed them, we can build the certain structures around there, looking at when they work and how they work, and can you change them from being honey collectors to pollen collectors, and all this kind of stuff, and what affects their health. And it's messy and it's sloppy, and it's really hard to. They just don't like cranberries, and so the way around that is you just buy rent lots and lots of bumblebees. Honeybees, and just saturate it. And if you're lucky, you get 3 or 4 days of good weather, and the honeybees do their job. But I think getting a lot of the bloom on the early end and the tail end is probably going to be contingent on the bumblebee.
Well, thanks so much for taking the time, and I hope our cranberry growers are safe. I know they've got to do a lot of work right now with COVID-19. It's a difficult situation to do work, so tip our hats to all our cranberry growers in the Pacific Northwest for continuing to keep the crop going. And you stay safe.
Well, I guess it just, as you were saying that, reminded me of what happened to our native Bombus occidentalis.
And, right.
A disease came in and wiped out that population, and they don't exist anymore.
That's a good point, because we were talking about occidentalis, western bumblebee, in the studies you did in the 90s were really the predominant ones, but really because of the diseases that were introduced, they really have retreated. The range reduction of western bumblebee is a really sad story.
It brings it back to home, and it makes it current that this is not just stuff that affects us as humans. It affects the natural population, the natural ecology of the native species.
Yeah, sadly. Well, stay safe, Kim, and thanks for taking time to talk to us about this. And I hope lots of growers get ideas, because I think this is what you've developed is a really cost-effective, easy to implement system that could be used on, at least in the Willamette Valley. I can see this being something that would fit really well into a lot of farms.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and you're doing a great job.
Thanks a lot, Kim.
All right.
Thank you so much for listening. The show is produced by Quinn Sinan-Neal, who's a student here at OSU in the New Media Communications program, and the show wouldn't even be possible without the support of the Oregon Legislature, the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, and Western SARE. Show notes with links mentioned on each episode are available on the website, which is at pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's several ways to connect with me. The first one is you can visit the website and leave an episode-specific comment. You can suggest a future guest or topic, or ask a question that could be featured in a future episode. But you can do the same things on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook by visiting the Oregon Bee Project. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next week.